it's funny how life can often imitate art. Cyberpunk 2077 had a tumultuous launch back in 2020, and since then it has been poked, patched and augmented many times over, with CDP's latest update pushing it into Overdrive by name and by nature, adding the holy grail of path tracing to the mix. But first, let's start with a quick quiz and just how and where it differs from the old ray tracing we already had. Now on screen you can see three images, A, B and C, and these are either rasterized at ultra settings, ray traced at ultra settings or path traced. Now based on the comparison and info in this video, look at each and then determine which is which. We'll come back to it later in the video, and hopefully throughout this it will aid you to notice the main areas to look for within this emerging technology for real-time games at least. So what is new? Well, Nvidia released a technology video that details the core aspects, talking to CD Projekt Red, but as a quick summary, here we go. The original method, like all non-ray trace titles, uses a geometry buffer to draw all objects within a frame, and then multiple passes are made over these objects and their materials to colour them, shade them, light them, and ultimately try to emulate a realistic view of this decadent 80s themed future. The environmental artists and lighting teams did an exceptional job capturing the neon punk filled ambience throughout Night City, and even compared to the ray trace and path trace modes, it's a superb looking title, and nothing detracts from that here. The work the team did to hand place light, tweak materials, textures and more is a testament to the adage that great art can trump great technology, and in fact much of the physically based materials, high quality geometry are needed for the enhanced modes to work, as they play off or still incorporate much of these long standing and old school rasterized techniques, such as screen space effects in reflections, ambient occlusion amongst others. Now this mode relies on image-based lighting for many reflections and global illumination by sampling probes placed across the game world, and these incorporate fixed points of day which are then blended to create the real-time lighting the game has across all modes. Now next up we have ray tracing, which was added close to launch on PC and current gen consoles, but the PC has got the biggest feature set. As a hybrid model, it still heavily relies on large portions of the raster mode, such as analytical fixed lights, light and reflection probes, and even mixed screen space effects such as SSR, and even shadow maps. But these are augmented with ray trace shadows, which are limited to sun and moon and certain interior lights within the game, which is what the consoles run. But there is a limit to the shadow casting lights the game can have. In addition, emissive surfaces and lights from the sky dome are calculated into a diffuse reflectance or illumination, meaning lights can scatter and shade surfaces within the game. This also includes ray traced ambient occlusion, which helps ground objects within the world and improve with more accurate self and contact shadows. Finally, reflections are now augmented with ray tracing, allowing off-screen objects to still appear in reflective surfaces and dynamic objects. Now these are all built and managed within a bounding volume hierarchy of lower quality proxy models, and this is the biggest demand on VRAM, system RAM and CPU time, and it's still in use in the new path trace mode. Now the Psycho mode also adds a single sun bounce for global illumination depending on the scene, and this can be demanding. So over the raster mode, you can certainly see much better light attenuation, improved material reactions, significantly better ambient occlusion, and most of the SSR disocclusion artifacts and noise are removed or at least reduced. Which brings us to path tracing, or full ray tracing, which again is a hybrid solution, as certain elements such as glass are not changed here with this technique. It is still in a preview state, which means it can still have issues and occasional crashes, but this is mostly related to running out of VRAM. Now this mode now unifies many of the separate passes from the ray trace mode into a dual lighting pass over those same G buffers. The method of path tracing is to draw the view from the camera at a per pixel, or at least a level of samples per pixel. Here the ray is traced into the scene. Once it intersects with a surface, it then samples the material and fires off recursive rays further into and across the frustum view. From here it will detect direct illumination and shadow from every light source in the scene, and then also calculate multiple indirect illumination for diffuse and specular surfaces. Now these two methods unify the ray trace mode here, meaning some economies of scale come into this. adding almost limitless shadow casting light sources now, which had a finite level in the raster and ray trace modes. But the global illumination is the biggest and most obvious increase, with light now bouncing off and onto other surfaces, increasing the radiosity level as surfaces now bounce colour and increase the lighting into certain areas, whilst also improving the shading and shadow quality in others. One of the biggest visual gains is that they are not cooled off into the far distance of the camera frustum now. As you can see here, on the raster and ray trace modes, the merchant shelves and pots have no ambient occlusion or shadows at this distance, but the path trace solution does. The neon signs now light other surfaces more, reflections are more stochastic and have contact hardening present from the source, and when we move in close, all modes now have shadow and ambient occlusion present, but the shadow map resolution and SSO pass in the raster mode looks very unstable and very gamer-like here, whereas the ray trace mode is drastically improved with its soft penumbra shadows that feather out from the emitter and far more accurate ambient occlusion. But the path tracing mode improves this further, and we can now see the light bounce under the pots from the shelf and other areas of the scene, including the merchant himself, which, although minor, is much closer to reality that these techniques are aiming for. Across a variety of tested interior and exterior scenes with static and dynamic objects and characters, the new mode improves material quality significantly. Lighting accuracy and bounce is the biggest increase, and although reflections are better than the ray trace mode, they still present some errors and colour issues from time to time, and even though they're a higher resolution, effectively based now on your output resolution settings, they don't look significantly better, although there are more of them and they do cast and reflect more objects, certainly further into the camera frustum. But the consistency of the world lighting and attenuation across the game is much better than that ray trace mode. It's drastically better than the raster mode, and character models, though, they're not always improved, and much like real life, when the lighting is not quite right, it can leave faces and scenes more flat and less dramatic than the hand-placed and stylized lighting the raster and even ray trace mode uses with its analytical light sources. It highlights how these solutions are never really a silver bullet and will always have pros and cons, but again, one of the main benefits is an artist will always pick the best looking view based on their eyes, and the ray trace options here will never do that. They're just aiming to be more physically accurate. So with the explanation of how it all works and differs, there are some issues here. The path tracing mode, for example, has too much light and bloom underneath this bridge that just wouldn't have this much reflectance, and in actual fact the ray tracing and rasterized versions look better and more accurate than the path tracing one. But that's always going to be a balance between a mathematically driven lighting solution compared to an artist driven one. This is exemplified with some of the scenes at night time and walking down streets hardly looking any different going from raster to path trace to ray tracing, because Fundamentally, it can only do what's possible with the lighting sources that are there, and the artist did an exceptional job delivering on that visual quality, which means you will see points in the title, as you see here, where it's hard to spot the difference. The biggest improvement is on materials and specular and diffuse reflections, now having stochastic reflections, contact hardening, and picking up the micro facets of each surface from the wet roads or pavement all looks visually much better and more realistic. Light bleed is resolved or reduced significantly, and overall the consistency of the lighting quality is much better. But you will not always see a better looking or drastically different looking scene, and at times it can even be visually less pleasing than the artistic driven one, which is fundamentally the point of video games and movies. What you'll really see in most of the time from the path trace to ray trace version is a darker image overall, as those analytical lights are removed, and therefore you get better shadowing and shading quality, but an overall darker image because it can only rely on the light sources from the sun and the moon. As you see here, walking down the street going from path tracing to the rasterized view, it really doesn't jump out at you that the subtle differences of light bounce and bleed are all solved in the path trace version, but the artistically driven rasterized version is not significantly worse, but it does perform significantly better, and that is where the biggest challenges arise. But overall, the improvements here are quite impressive, and from a technological point of view, it's incredible that we're already seeing path trace titles in modern games at this point. But you always have to be careful with that balance of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. New technology doesn't mean you have to drop everything else before it. With overall the character models looking better in the stylized, rasterized or ray trace modes using those analytical light sources. But again, much of this will become a subjective opinion. And going back to the original point when we started the video, did you get it right? If so, well done. If not, don't worry about it. It means little, other than technology can be hard to pinpoint at times, and certainly when it comes to lighting in games, this is always going to be very subjective. But on a technical level, the path tracing here is very impressive and paints a picture of how it can and will be used in modern games quite extensively. If only the Red engine was not being laid to rest, but hopefully much of the work done here can be carried over to the UE5 powered Witcher reboot currently in the works. So as you see on these images, you now know which one is which. So again, using this bar scene, you should be able to see the difference between the A, B and C and calculate which one is which falls down to that category of you might choose the worst looking mode from a technical perspective, but that doesn't make it wrong. But there is one thing we need to discuss in more depth, and that is the performance requirements and overall the resolution requirements that this mode needs. Now, there is a lot around the fact that it's been advertised heavily with the RTX4090, and that really comes down to the fact that path tracing specifically, but overall a lot of sparse rendering techniques we now use in many modern titles, do require a higher resolution output to get to a level that is stable. The denoising path that Nvidia use on all of their ray tracing techniques is still in use here, and the lower the base resolution, the more noisy and stochastic that becomes, and it scales linearly with resolution. I.e. the higher up the resolution stack you are, the better everything looks because it needs a higher base. 1080p is possibly the minimum you should be reconstructing from, but I would recommend that really you should be somewhere around a 1440p level, certainly in the solution being used here, as it can become very, very noisy and overall a worse image quality than the other two modes on any other piece of hardware outside of an RTX 4090. This is certainly true of AMD cards, but equally true even to a point of my RTX 3080, which is the best GPU I have access to at the moment. But it is very demanding on hardware. Now, from a visual quality and technical point of view, it's excellent, and it's a significant step forward from the previous path trace updates we've already seen in games such as Doom, Portal and Half-Life, among others. But like those games, it's very demanding as a solution, and unlike those games, it really requires high-end hardware and DLSS 2 or 3 to run anywhere close to playable and visually pleasing levels. Fundamentally, it can look worse on anything outside of a 4090. Now, some of this is also down to the inherent challenges that ray tracing brings. Fundamentally, divergence of rays, materials, and thus memory, cache, and processing. You see, GPUs need to be kept working in parallel, and with ray tracing and the extended form here with path tracing, this is often not the case. The latest RTX 4000 cards have a key hardware accelerated benefit in shader execution reordering, or SER, which is extensively used here, with ray tracing being very divergent in that a ray's intersection on any given triangle could go in any random direction. The complexity of ray tracing algorithms means coherency is low, and the GPU compute work that is then kicked off to calculate the given reflectance, refraction or radiosity, or even direct shadow can and likely will be non-uniformed and structured. As such, the given threads or wavefronts within the GPU can be heavily underutilized when this happens, as the relevant compute work is serialized based on material rather than a parallelized work, and as such, the feature in the hardware resorts this so that each thread is filled or as close to filled as possible for each batch. It basically restructures each of those areas into a thread that is consistent with the material and direction of ray. Now this impacts the older RTX cards, and it severely impacts RDNA 2 and 3 cards. See here, even with the old RT Psycho mode on my 6800, it's around 12 to 15% under its peak GPU power load. And when moving from ray tracing to path tracing preview, we drop a further 20%. Fundamentally, it's losing around 35% of its potential wavefront load. It can't keep all of those cores fed with work, showing how underutilized many of the compute cores are per cycle. And this results in significantly lower performance on this card than even my RTX 2070 at 1080p, which is also affected in the same way, having underutilization of its overall power throughput. Not a surprise, as this solution has been built in conjunction and specific to the Nvidia driver and Ada Lovelace architecture in these latest RTX cards. As such, it heavily penalizes AMD GPUs and to a lesser degree older RTX cards, to the point where AMD GPUs really have unplayable performance or terrible image quality, or both. Therefore, the only cards I can recommend you run this overdrive mode on is an RTX 3080 or above, which puts you around a 4070 as a minimum, and even then to go to playable frame rates and quality, you really need DLSS 3, which then affects input latency. Now this in and of itself is not a bad thing, as therefore no one should expect to be able to run brand spanking new and demanding technology on older hardware, but certainly the demands on even brand new hardware might be a little higher than many may think. And AMD players certainly leave a lot of performance on the table, leaving it more of a technical curiosity than anything I could recommend at the moment on AMD GPUs. And even Nvidia players have to be aware of the requirements being anywhere from a 3080 upwards. But this is a free preview after all, and a potential insight into the opportunities and graphical quality we can expect in the future. But that doesn't distract from what is a technical blinding light in terms of just what we can look forward to in the very near future. Anyway, that's it for another deep dive into game, PC, performance and graphical technology. Remember, if you enjoy what we do here on IGN, then keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll catch you on the next one.